Humanity broke every law of the Galactic Council and won. Personal Log, Commander Yara Solis, United Earth Fleet, UES Defiant. Part 1, The Laws We Never Agreed to. The document was 4,012 pages long. I know because I counted. Not the pages, a machine did that, but I read every single word myself, sitting at my desk with cold coffee and a growing fury that I could not name at first. By page 300, I had a word for it. By page 900, I had stopped underlining and started writing my own notes in the margins. By the final page, I had filled 2 notebooks. They called it the Galactic Covenant of Civilized Conduct, the Council's welcome gift to humanity. The Verk ambassador had handed it to our delegation on Vel Prime with what I can only describe as a patient smile. The kind a teacher gives a child who does not yet understand that the classroom has rules. No one on Earth had written a single sentence of it. No human had been consulted, interviewed, or invited to suggest even a comma. It had been written over 6 centuries by the 5 dominant species of the Galactic Council, and it told us exactly how we were expected to behave now that we had been found. I was 29 years old when first contact happened. I was 31 when I received my commission aboard the UES Defiant, Earth's first deep space warship. I was 33 when I finished reading the Covenant and realized what it really was. A cage, a very well-written, beautifully organized cage. Law number 4 stated that Class D provisional species, that was us, the lowest classification possible, were not permitted to operate military vessels beyond their home system. The Defiant, by existing, was already a violation. I had been in command of a crime before I ever left orbit. Law number 308 stated that Class D species could not conduct independent faster-than-light research. We had been doing that for 11 years. 11 years of quiet, determined, brilliant work by engineers and physicists in labs across 6 continents, and it was all, according to the Covenant, illegal. Law number 1042 stated that Class D species were required to submit population data, resource consumption reports, and territorial expansion plans to the Council on a quarterly basis, for review and approval. We were required to ask permission to grow. I set that page down and stared at the wall for a long time. The thing that made it worse, the thing that made my hands shake slightly as I poured more cold coffee, was how reasonable it all sounded on the surface. The language was careful. The Covenant spoke of harmony, of shared galactic stability, of protecting younger species from the consequences of their own recklessness. Every restriction was wrapped in the language of care. We were not being caged. We were being protected from ourselves. I had heard that argument before. Every person who had ever tried to control another person had used some version of it. Our ambassador to the Council was a man named George Alderton. He was 62 years old, had spent 30 years in diplomacy, and was genuinely one of the most patient and careful people I had ever met. He arrived on Vel Prime with a team of 40, a translation suite that had taken 4 years to build, and a formal proposal from the United Earth government requesting that humanity be elevated to Class C status and given a seat on the lower advisory board. He was given a waiting number, like a ticket at a government office. He waited 11 days before his meeting was confirmed. When he finally entered the council chamber, he stood at a small podium positioned noticeably lower than the desks of the senior delegates, a design choice that was not accidental and presented Earth's case with dignity and precision. The Verk delegate, a tall, gray-scaled figure named Consul Dravith, listened without interrupting. Then he spoke for 4 minutes. The translation came through in Alderton's earpiece, and the full transcript reached me 3 hours later. Dravith had said, essentially, that humanity's request showed promise but was premature, that Earth species had a long history of internal conflict and had only recently stopped directing significant violence at one another, that the Council would be watching our progress with great interest, that we were welcome to reapply in 40 years. 40 years. Alderton thanked him, collected his materials, and walked out of the chamber. In the corridor, away from the cameras, he sat down on a bench and put his head in his hands. One of his aides told me this later. She said he sat there for almost 10 minutes without speaking. I understood that. What I did not understand, what I refused to accept, was that the correct response to that moment was patience. Some of my colleagues argued for it. Give it time. Learn the system. Work within the structure they have built. Do not make enemies before we have made friends. I read Law number 1847 that same week. It stated that no Class D or Class C species could interfere in a conflict formally sanctioned between two council species, regardless of the humanitarian impact on uncertified civilizations in the affected region. Uncertified civilizations, that was the phrase. Species that had not yet been found and classified by the council did not have legal standing. They did not count. If two council species decided to conduct a war near a planet full of living, breathing people who had no idea the galaxy existed, those people had no protection. The law said so, clearly, on page 1094. I made a note next to it. The note said, "We will never follow this one." I did not write it as a threat or a declaration. I wrote it the way you write a reminder to yourself about something obvious. Of course we would not follow it. Of course. What kind of people would we have to be to follow it? The kind of people the council expected us to be, apparently. The Defiant was a good ship. She was not the largest vessel ever built, not the most advanced by any measure a council species would recognize, but she was honest. Every system on her had been designed and built by human hands, tested by human engineers who had never had the benefit of 600 years of galactic knowledge. She was full of workarounds and clever fixes and solutions that a more experienced civilization might have found embarrassing. I found them beautiful. Her crew was 140 people. They came from 18 countries and spoke, between them, 31 languages. They argued about food constantly. They ran betting pools on nearly everything. They worked 18-hour shifts without complaint during the long transit runs, and then slept like stones and woke up ready to do it again. They were, without exception, the most capable and most frustrating group of humans I had ever been responsible for. My first officer was a man named Colin Fraser. He was from Edinburgh, had a dry humor that took most people 3 weeks to detect, and was absolutely unshakable in a crisis. I had served with him for 4 years before the Defiant, and I trusted him completely, which is a rarer thing than most people realize. My chief engineer was a woman named Priya Nair. She had 3 advanced degrees, had published 6 research papers on FTL field mechanics, and referred to the Defiant's drive systems the way other people referred to beloved pets. She named components. She talked to the engine. She was also, in my opinion, the single most important person on the ship, and she knew it, and she was gracious enough not to mention it too often. There were others. There were always others, and I will write about them as they become part of this story, because they all do. For now, what matters is this. We were out there. Earth's first deep space crew, aboard Earth's first illegal warship, reading our welcome package and making notes in the margins. The council had handed us a list of rules. We had already decided, quietly and without ceremony, that some of those rules did not apply to us. Not because we were reckless, not because we did not understand the consequences, but because we had read every word and we had seen what those rules were really protecting. And it was not us. My log entry that night was short. I wrote, "They handed us a cage and called it a constitution. Tomorrow we leave for the Kepler transit corridor. There are reports of instability in the contested zone. The council has not asked us to respond. They will not ask us to respond. We are going anyway." I closed the notebook. I finished the cold coffee. I went to bed. I slept perfectly well. Part 2, the first law we broke. I heard about the Kepler contested zone from a signals officer named Ben Calloway. who had been quietly monitoring council communications for 6 months and had developed a gift for reading between the formal language and understanding what was actually happening. He knocked on my cabin door at just past midnight ship time, and when I opened it, his expression told me everything before he spoke a single word. 3 weeks before our arrival, the Dihar and the Venkai had formally registered their conflict with the council. Registered it as though war were a business filing. They submitted paperwork, received a sanction code, and proceeded to move their fleets into the contested zone with full legal authorization. The council's only requirement was that they avoid certified worlds. Everything else was permitted. There were 3 worlds in the zone that the council had not yet classified, 3 planets with populations. Not primitive in the dismissive sense. They had cities, agriculture, art, and presumably everything that made a species worth protecting. They simply had not been found and numbered yet, so they did not count. Ben spread his data across my desk and walked me through it. The Dihar fleet was moving in from the eastern corridor. The Venkai were cutting across the southern approach. The trajectory of their engagement, based on every model he had run, would bring the heaviest fighting directly through the orbital space above all 3 uncertified worlds within 11 days. I looked at the data for a long time. Then I went to the bridge and told Colin to set a course for Kepler. He did not ask why. He had read the same reports. He simply nodded and gave the order, and the Defiant's drive powered up with the familiar low hum that Priya loved and the rest of us had learned to find comforting. We arrived in the contested zone with 9 days to spare. What I had not expected was the scale of it. Both fleets were enormous. The Dihar had 63 vessels. The Venkai had 49. Every one of them dwarfed the Defiant. The smallest ship in either fleet was twice our length. The largest were the size of small cities. We had 6 ships. The Defiant and 5 escort vessels that the United Earth Fleet had sent to shadow us after Command received my notification of intent. I had sent the notification as a formality. I had not asked for permission, because I had known I would not receive it, and I had not wanted to force anyone to say no on record. Colin stood beside me at the command console and looked at the sensor display for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "This is either the bravest thing we have ever done or the most foolish." I said, "Probably both." He said, "Right then," and went back to his station. I opened a broadcast channel on every frequency the council used. I had written my statement the previous night, revised it 4 times, and eventually thrown away all 4 drafts and decided to speak plainly. I said, "This is Commander Yara Solis of the United Earth Fleet aboard the UES Defiant. We are positioning between your fleets and the 3 inhabited worlds in grid sectors 14, 15, and 22. We are asking you to halt your engagement. The people on those worlds have no part in your conflict. They do not know it exists. They cannot defend themselves. We are here because no one else came. We are asking you to stop. If you will not stop, we will remain here anyway." There was a long silence on all channels. Then the Dihar fleet commander responded. His name translated roughly as First Voice Karath, and his tone was not angry. It was something closer to baffled. He informed me that this engagement was legally sanctioned by the Galactic Council, that my presence was a violation of Council Law number 1847, and that my 6 vessels were in the direct path of 2 fleets totaling over 100 warships. I said, "Yes, I know." Another silence. Karath said, "You know." I said, "Yes. I have read the law. I disagree with it. I am still here." There was a longer pause. Then Karath's fleet reduced speed, not stopped, reduced. It was something. The Venkai were not as thoughtful. Their response came not through communication but through action. 3 of their forward vessels accelerated and opened fire, not at the inhabited worlds but at the Defiant and her escorts. A statement, a demonstration of what we were standing between. The first impact hit our port shield array and rang through the ship like a struck bell. I heard Priya's voice from engineering, clipped and focused, reporting damage to the secondary coupling. Ben Calloway was already tracking the firing trajectories. Our weapons officer, a young woman named Kate Drummond, had her hands on her console and was looking at me. I said, "Return fire, targeted and precise. Do not aim for their crew compartments. Hit their propulsion." Kate said, "Understood," and meant it in the way that told me she had already calculated it. What followed was not a glorious battle in any traditional sense. It was 6 small ships holding a position against a fleet that could have swept us aside in minutes, using every advantage we had, and our advantages were not firepower. They were speed, unpredictability, and a set of tactics that the Venkai had simply never encountered. Priya had spent 8 months designing what she called pressure cycling, a method of rapidly venting and redirecting drive plasma that made the Defiant's movement patterns almost impossible to predict. Combined with Colin's instinct for positioning and Kate's targeting precision, we were not winning exactly, but we were not losing either, which in that situation was its own kind of victory. The moment that changed everything came 40 minutes into the engagement. One of our escort ships, the cruiser Lewis, took severe damage to her main drive. She was drifting, still intact but unable to maneuver. The Venkai recognized a wounded vessel and moved to finish it. Standard tactics. Logical. Expected. What they did not expect was what the Lewis did next. Her commander, a man named Owen Price, made a decision in the span of about 4 seconds. He locked his ship's automated navigation to a direct intercept course with the largest Venkai vessel, set the drive to emergency discharge at point of contact, evacuated his crew to the emergency pods, and broadcast on open channel, "Clear the area." The Venkai did not know what to make of it. They had never seen a damaged ship turned into a deliberate kinetic strike. It was not in their doctrine. It was not in their records. It was not something a rational fleet would do, because a rational fleet would not sacrifice a ship with living crew aboard even after the crew had evacuated, because the cultural taboo against it was absolute. We did not have that taboo. Not because we did not value lives, we had evacuated everyone, but because we had spent our entire history finding ways to use what we had, even when what we had was broken. The impact was significant. The Venkai's largest vessel lost propulsion entirely and began to drift. The 3 forward ships that had been advancing on our position stopped. There was a pause in the firing that lasted exactly long enough for me to open the channel again. I said, "We are not going anywhere. Your largest ship is disabled. We have 14 more vessels in transit to this position," which was not entirely true, though 2 more Earth ships were in fact en route. "I am asking again. Stop." The Venkai fleet held position. They did not advance. They did not fire. The Dihar, who had been watching the entire exchange from a distance, formally withdrew from the engagement sector. Karath sent a brief message that translated as, "We will observe the halt. This is unusual." I sent back, "Thank you, I meant it." Owen Price and his crew were recovered from their pods 4 hours later. He came aboard the Defiant with a cut on his forehead, a borrowed jacket, and what I can only describe as a slightly stunned expression, as though he was not entirely sure what he had just done. I shook his hand in the main corridor in front of half the crew. I said, "That was one of the bravest things I have ever seen." He said, "I may have also been one of the most absurd things you have ever seen." I said, "Those are not mutually exclusive." The 3 worlds below us never knew any of it had happened. The Council's formal violation decree arrived 11 hours later. It cited Law 1847, unauthorized military action, interference in a sanctioned engagement, and 2 additional subsections I had not previously memorized. The fine was significant. The language was severe. Colin printed it out and handed it to me on the bridge. I read it, folded it carefully, and put it in my desk drawer. Later that evening, I had it framed. My log that night said, They find us for saving lives. I framed the citation. The 3 worlds below us are still there. The people on them went about their day with no knowledge that anything unusual had occurred. They had breakfast. They went to work. Their children played outside. That is what we protected. A normal Tuesday on 3 planets that the Galactic Council considers too unimportant to name. I think that is the most important thing I have ever done. I think we are just getting started. Part 3, the ones who started watching. The messages began arriving quietly, the way most important things do. The first one came through a back channel in the Council's civilian communication network, not the official diplomatic lines, not any frequency monitored by the dominant species. Someone had found a gap in the architecture, a small and overlooked corridor of signal traffic, and used it to send 3 sentences to a human communication relay near Vel Prime. The message said, "We have been watching what your ships did in the Kepler zone. We are the Talani delegation. We are not permitted to contact you officially, but we wanted you to know that what you did mattered to us." I read it 3 times. Then I called Colin into my office and read it to him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who are the Talani?" I pulled up the Council records. The Talani were a species that had been members of the Galactic Council for over 200 years, one of the oldest member species, in fact, from a technical standpoint. But they held no seat on any senior board. They had no vote on legislation. Their role within the Council structure was classified in the official documents as administrative support, which was a formal way of saying that they served. They maintained the buildings on Vel Prime. They managed the scheduling systems. They prepared and delivered meals at council functions. They translated documents in the lower offices. They were everywhere in the council's infrastructure and completely invisible in its power structure. 200 years of membership and they were still, effectively, servants. I wrote back through the same gap in the network. I said, "We received your message. We are grateful. Tell us what you need." The response took 4 days, which told me that whoever was sending these messages was being very careful. When it came, it contained not 3 sentences but 3 pages. It was a careful, precise account of the Talani people's history with the Council, how they had joined, what they had been promised, what had actually happened, how the structure had closed around them so gradually that by the time they understood what they had agreed to, it was too late to change it without consequences they could not survive alone. It was not a unique story. That was the part that stayed with me. Because by the time the 3rd and 4th messages arrived from other species, the Gret, who had been forcibly disarmed by the Council 50 years prior after a conflict they still disputed, a small species called the Alani, whose home world had been classified as a resource zone without their consent, I realized we were not looking at individual grievances. We were looking at a pattern. The Council had been doing this for 600 years, finding species, classifying them, bringing them in at the lowest tier, offering them the language of inclusion while building structures that ensured certain species would always hold the power and others would always serve it. And because each species experienced it alone from the inside, it was very hard to see the whole shape of it from any one position. We were new. We had not been inside long enough to stop seeing it. In the middle of all of this, the Council moved against us formally for the first time. We had accumulated 11 violation decrees by the start of 2190. The Kepler incident was the most visible, but there were others. A rescue operation near the Drath corridor that violated 3 separate Council statutes, a moment where Priya's engineering team had shared FTL research with a Class D species we had encountered and liked, a diplomatic contact we had made with the Talani without Council authorization. Each one was documented, filed, and used to build a case. The proposal that came before the Council floor in the spring of 2190 was to reclassify humanity as a hostile species. Under Council law, a hostile species classification removed all protections and diplomatic standing. It opened certain legal pathways that I will not describe in detail, but that everyone on the Defiant understood perfectly. The vote was scheduled for 60 days out. I received a summons to appear before the full council and answer for the violations in person. George Alderton contacted me the same day. He was calm on the screen, but I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, and I had known him long enough to read it clearly. He said, "Yara, I need you to understand what this vote means. If it passes, we lose every protection we currently have." I said, "I understand." He said, "The approach I am recommending is a formal apology and a commitment to compliance going forward. It is not ideal, but it buys us time, and time is what we need right now." I said, "George, with great respect, an apology for what exactly? For saving 3 worlds, for sharing research, for speaking to species the Council has decided we are not allowed to speak to." He was quiet. I said, "If I walk in there and apologize, I am telling them that their laws are legitimate. I am telling everyone watching, and people are watching, that the correct response to an unjust rule is to bow to it. I am not willing to do that." He said, "You understand what you are risking?" I said, "I do. I also understand what we are risking if we don't." The council chamber on Vel Prime was larger than I expected. I had seen images, but images do not convey the full weight of a room designed to make whoever stands at the center podium feel small. The ceiling was very high. The delegates sat in a rising arc above the speaker's position, so everyone looked down at you. The acoustics made your own voice return to you slightly delayed, which was disorienting until I stopped noticing it. There were delegates from 43 species present. I recognized several of them from the files. Consul Dravith of the Verk sat in the central position, gray-scaled and patient. To his left was the Dihar senior delegate, who I noted had voted against the hostile classification in the preliminary session. To his right was the Venkai representative, who had not. I was given 10 minutes to speak. I did not use a prepared statement. I had written one, revised it 5 times, and then put it in my pocket and decided not to use it. Instead, I picked up the one document I had brought with me, a printed copy of the Galactic Council's own founding charter, and I started reading from it. Not my words, theirs. I read the preamble, which spoke of all sentient species being equal in worth and dignity. I read Article 3, which stated that no species should be subject to laws they had no voice in creating. I read Article 7, which guaranteed all member species the right to peaceful contact with other member species without prior council approval. I read Article 12, which stated that the preservation of uncertified civilizations was a shared responsibility of all council members, not subject to sanction waivers. I read slowly and clearly, and after each passage I looked up at the chamber and said simply, "We followed this. We did not follow the covenant. We followed this, your own founding document, the one this entire structure claims to be built on." I said, "You are proposing to classify us as hostile because we acted in accordance with the principles this council was created to uphold, and in violation of the rules the council created to protect its own power structure. I want to name that clearly in this room, in front of every delegate here, because I think it needs to be said out loud." The chamber was very quiet. I said, "We are not going to apologize, not because we are arrogant and not because we do not understand the consequences, but because the species in this room who are watching, the ones who have been in this structure for a long time and have learned to stay quiet, they are watching to see what happens when someone tells the truth. And if we apologize now, we are telling them that the truth has no value here." I closed the charter. I said, "We ask for nothing except that you apply your own rules fairly. That is all, thank you." I walked back to my seat. The silence held for several seconds. Then, from the far left of the chamber, in the section reserved for administrative support staff, where the Talani sat, a single delegate rose to their feet and began to clap. It was a small sound in a large room, but it was not a small moment. 2 other Talani delegates stood. then a Gret representative, then 3 delegates from species I did not recognize. The applause was quiet and careful, nothing like a celebration, but it was real and it was visible, and every senior delegate in that arc above us could see it. Draveth's expression did not change, but he watched it. He watched all of it. The vote on the hostile classification took place 3 days later. It failed. 22 votes for 20 against, 1 abstention. 2 votes. That was the margin. Colin sent me a message the moment the result came through. It said, 2 votes. That is not comfortable. I wrote back, no, but it is enough for now. That evening I sat alone in my cabin and thought about the Talani delegate who had stood up first. I did not know her name. I did not know what it had cost her to do that, what she had risked, what conversations had happened after the session ended. I only knew that she had done it and that it had mattered. My log that night said, we did not just make enemies today. We made something far more dangerous to the people in that chamber. We made friends. Real ones, not allies of convenience, but people who stood up in a room where standing up was hard and did it anyway. That is a different thing. A much more valuable thing. I think we are beginning to understand what this is actually about. It was never just about Earth. It was never just about our 11 violations and our 1 illegal warship. It is about whether this structure, this 600-year-old machine, is going to keep running the way it has always run. And I think, for the first time, enough people in enough places are wondering the same thing. That is how things change. Not all at once, but from enough directions at the same time that the center cannot hold. Part 4. The law they wish we'd never found. It was not a soldier who found it, or a diplomat, or even a strategist. It was a historian named Ruth Albright, 44 years old, with reading glasses she refused to replace because she had owned the same pair for 11 years and saw no reason to change what was working. She had been embedded with our team for 8 months, brought aboard the Defiant as part of a program to document humanity's early years in the galactic community. Most of the time, she sat quietly in corners and wrote things down. People tended to forget she was there, which she used to her advantage in ways I respected enormously. She found the Kel provision in the archive world of Sauron on a Tuesday afternoon, in a subsection of the original Council founding documents that had not been cross-referenced in any modern legal index. The archive itself was on the 3rd sublevel of the oldest building on the planet, in a storage format that required translation tools Ruth had spent 3 weeks learning to use. No one had looked at this section in a very long time, which, as she later told me, was probably not an accident. She sent me a message that evening. It said, "Yara, I have found something. Come when you can. Do not bring a large group." I went alone. The Kel provision was 47 lines long. It was written in the founding language of the Velari, the oldest of the original Council species, and Ruth had spent 12 hours translating it with careful precision before she was confident in her version. It stated, in language that was surprisingly plain for a legal document 6 centuries old, that any species that had been subjected to laws without representation for a continuous period of no less than 15 years had the right to invoke a tribunal of first principles, a full legal review of the Council's composition and foundational laws, conducted by an independent panel drawn from non-dominant member species, with binding authority to mandate constitutional revision. I read it twice, then I read it a 3rd time. I said, "Is this real?" Ruth said, "It is absolutely real. I have verified it against 3 independent copies in the archive. It has never been formally repealed. It was simply not talked about." I said, "Why would the founders include this?" She said, "I think they included it because at the time they wrote it, they believed they were building something fair. They genuinely thought the structure they were creating would prevent the abuses that had defined the previous era of galactic conflict. They wrote this provision as a safety valve, a correction mechanism, because they were idealistic enough to believe it might occasionally be needed. And then the structure they built gradually became exactly what they were trying to avoid, and nobody wanted to admit that. And so this provision sat in a sub-level archive on Sauron, and nobody mentioned it for 600 years. I looked at those 47 lines for a long time. Then I said, "How quickly can you write a legal brief?" Ruth smiled, which was the expression of someone who had been hopping someone would ask them exactly that question. The brief took 3 weeks. Ruth worked with 2 legal scholars from Earth who joined us via relay, and together they built the most precise and careful argument I have ever read. They documented every species that had been brought into the Council in the last 600 years. They showed the pattern of classification, restriction, and structural exclusion. They showed that Class D and Class C species had been operating under Council laws for an average of 90 years without any meaningful representation. They showed that the Talani had been members for over 2 centuries without a voting seat. They showed that the Gret disarmament had been imposed by Council decree without the Gret being permitted to present a counterargument. They showed the whole shape of it in one document with citations. When I read the final draft, I felt something I can only describe as a kind of cold clarity. Not anger exactly, though the anger was there underneath it. Something more focused. This was the argument. This was the thing we had been building toward without fully knowing it. We invoked the Kell provision on a Wednesday morning. The filing went to the Council's legal registry, as required by the provision itself. The registrar, a Talani clerk named Sauron, who I will never forget, received it, read the first 3 pages, and then looked up at the human courier who had delivered it with an expression I wish I could describe more precisely. It was not quite disbelief. It was more like the expression of someone who had been waiting for something for a very long time and had stopped believing it would actually arrive. Sauron said, "This will need to go to the senior legal office for verification." The courier said, "Of course. We have provided 30 supporting documents. The original Kell provision text is included as Appendix A." Sauron said very quietly, "I know what it is. I have known about it for years." The courier said nothing. Sauron registered the filing, stamped it, and logged it in the system without another word. The courier left. Sauron sat at the desk for a moment, then returned to work. The Council's legal office confirmed the filing's validity 48 hours later because there was no legal basis to deny it. The Kell provision existed. It had not been repealed. Its conditions had been met many times over. The filing was valid. And then the Council did something I had not fully anticipated. They panicked. Not openly. Nothing in the Galactic Council was ever done openly when it could be done through process. But the speed with which emergency sessions were called, the speed with which legal teams from the dominant species were mobilized, the speed with which Consul Draveth requested an urgent private meeting with George Alderton, all of it told me that the people at the top of this structure understood exactly what the Kell provision meant. It meant their laws could be reviewed by someone other than themselves, with binding authority. It meant that 600 years of careful construction could be examined and found to be what it was. George Alderton called me from Vel Prime the morning after the filing was confirmed. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, but there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something energized. He said, "Yara, I need to tell you something. When you told me you were not going to apologize in that chamber, I thought you were making a mistake. A brave one, but a mistake. I want to say clearly that I was wrong." I said, "George, you have been fighting this battle much longer than I have. I would not have gotten this far without the groundwork you laid." He said, "That is generous. The Verk have requested an urgent diplomatic meeting. I expect it to be direct." He was understating it. The Verk meeting was held in a private chamber on Vel Prime 3 days after the filing. And the account I received from the 2 people who attended on our behalf was precise enough that I could reconstruct it almost word for word. Consul Draveth was not alone. He had 4 members of the Verk Senior Council with him, which was unusual. He had also dropped the patient, measured tone he used in formal settings. He was direct. He said that the Kell provision filing was a destabilizing action. He said that the Council's stability was the foundation of peace in the known galaxy, and that anything which threatened that stability threatened every species within it. He said that humanity was young and did not fully understand the consequences of what it was doing. He said that if we withdrew the filing, the 11 violation decrees against us would be cleared, and we would be elevated immediately to Class C status. Then he paused and said, "If you do not withdraw, we cannot guarantee your safety." Our representative, a steady, quiet man named Patrick Cole, who had been George Alderton's deputy for years, and had a gift for remembering exactly what was said in rooms where things were said that people later wished had not been, wrote down every word Draveth spoke, and sent it to me in full that evening. I read it, and then I did something Draveth would not have expected. I shared it, not with Earth's government first, not with our legal team. I shared it with the Talani, with the Gret, with the Alani, and with every other species that had been quietly in contact with us over the preceding months. I shared it because Draveth had made a threat in a private room, and private rooms are where powerful people say things they do not want witnessed, and one of the most effective things you can do with a private threat is make it public. Within a week, the Talani formally joined our filing as co-petitioners. The Gret followed the next day. 6 other species, most of whom had never made a public political statement in their entire council membership, added their names. The filing was no longer a human complaint. It was a coalition. Colin came to find me on the bridge the afternoon the last co-petition was confirmed. He stood beside me and looked at the sensor display for a moment. Then he said, "Do you remember what I said in the Kepler zone about whether this was brave or foolish?" I said, "I remember." He said, "I am revising my assessment. This is something else entirely. I am not sure we have a word for it." I said, "We will think of one." My log that evening was longer than usual. I wrote, "They showed us who they really were, and I am grateful for it. Not because it confirmed anything I did not already suspect, but because they showed us in a way that everyone else could see. Consul Draveth threatened us in a room he thought was private. He believed that power speaks quietly and is obeyed. He has been right about that for 600 years. He may be right for a little while longer. But the room is not as private as he thought, and more people are listening than he knows, and that changes the calculation in ways that I do not think he has fully calculated yet. We are going to the tribunal. I do not know what it will look like when we get there. I know we will not be standing there alone, and I know that whatever comes next, we found this through honesty. We did not manipulate anyone. We did not promise things we could not deliver. We found a law that was true, and we used it the way it was meant to be used. If that is breaking the law, then I am comfortable being guilty of it. Part 5 we won, but not how you would think. The morning the Grand Tribunal convened, I woke before my alarm. Ship time was early, just past 4 in the morning, and the Defiant was quiet around me in the way that ships are quiet when the night watch is on, and most of the crew is asleep. I lay in my bunk and stared at the ceiling for a few minutes, and I thought about a lot of things that I will not write about here because some thoughts are not meant to become records. Then I got up, made coffee, and went to the bridge. Ben Calloway was on night watch. He looked up when I came in, then at the clock, then back at me with the expression of a man who had expected this and was not surprised. He said, "Big day." I said, "Yes." He said, "Sensor grid is clear. The Verk fleet jumped in at 241 ships, holding position at the outer marker above Vel Prime. No communication yet." I said, "How far out?" He said, "Close enough to make a statement, not close enough to be the first to do something they would have to answer for." I said, "That sounds like the Verk." He nodded and went back to his screens. I stood at the observation window for a while and looked at Vel Prime below us. It was a beautiful planet from orbit, pale blue-green, with long sweeping cloud formations across the northern continent, and the lights of the capital city visible through the gaps in the weather. 600 years of galactic governance had been conducted from that city. 600 years of laws written by the powerful for the powerful, wearing the language of fairness and stability and shared progress. Today, for the first time, those laws were going to be examined by someone other than the people who wrote them. The tribunal was scheduled to open at 9 in the morning, local Vel prime time. We had approximately 5 hours. I went back to my cabin, showered, put on my dress uniform, and spent 20 minutes doing nothing in particular except sitting at my desk and being still. It is a skill I learned late and practice imperfectly, but it helps. At 7, there was a knock at my door. It was Priya. She had brought food, actual cooked food from the galley, which she almost never did, which meant she had been awake since before me. She set it on my desk without asking and sat down in the chair across from me. She said, "The drive is running clean. I checked it at 5. I said, "You checked the drive at 5 in the morning because you could not sleep." She said, "I check the drive when I am anxious. It is productive." I said, "How is she?" She said, meaning the ship, "She is ready. Whatever happens today, she will take us wherever we need to go after it." There is a particular kind of loyalty that comes from people who have been through difficult things with you, and it does not sound like speeches or declarations. It sounds like Priya Nair sitting in your cabin at 7 in the morning telling you the drive is running clean. I am grateful for it every time. The decision I had made, the one that I believe changed everything that happened in that chamber, was made 3 days before the tribunal. I had called a meeting of our full delegation, which included George Alderton, Patrick Cole, Ruth Albright, and representatives from all 6 co-petitioning species. We sat together in a conference room on the council's visitor level, and I laid out what I was thinking. I said, "I am not going to be the one who speaks for this petition. Not today, not for the opening argument." The room was quiet. I said, "This stopped being humanity's petition the moment the Talani and the Gret and the others joined it. If I stand at that podium today, the story becomes about humans challenging the council, and that is not the right story. The right story is that this coalition of species, some of whom have been in this system for over a century, and have been waiting their entire membership for someone to find the mechanism that makes this possible, has invoked its legal right to a fair review. And the person who should say that is someone who has lived inside this structure longer than we have." Another silence. Then the Talani representative spoke. Her name was Senna, and she had been in council administration for 31 years. She was small, quiet, with a precise way of speaking that conveyed enormous care for language. She said, "You are proposing to step aside." I said, "Yes, if you are willing." She said, "Why would you do that? This gives you less visibility, less credit." I said, "I do not want credit for it. I want it to work." Senna looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Yes, I will speak." She was extraordinary. I watched her walk to the center podium of the Grand Tribunal chamber that morning, and I understood, watching her, that she had been preparing for this for 31 years without knowing it. Every slight, every session where she had been talked over, every decision made by the council that had affected her people without a single Talani voice in the room, all of it had sharpened her into someone who knew exactly what she wanted to say and exactly how to say it. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She simply spoke with complete precision for 47 minutes, and by the time she was finished, the chamber was entirely still. She laid out the history, the pattern, the 600 years of selective inclusion. She named species. She named dates. She cited the founding charter the way I had in my own appearance before the council, but with 30 additional years of institutional knowledge behind her. And when she closed with a direct reading of the Kell provision and its clear applicability to the documented record, there was nothing for the opposing counsel to meaningfully refute. The law existed. The conditions were met. The coalition was real. The Verk's legal team tried. They were skilled and experienced and had spent 8 weeks building their counterargument. They challenged the translation of the original Kell provision. They argued that the provision had been implicitly superseded by subsequent legislation. They argued that the coalition's co-petitions did not meet the standing requirements. For each argument, Ruth Albright's brief had an answer, and Patrick Cole delivered those answers with the quiet precision of a man who has read every document in the room and is simply telling you what is in them. Outside above Vel Prime, the Verk fleet held its position. I was on the Defiance bridge when the alert came through. Ben's voice was very steady. He said, "Commander, the Verk fleet is breaking formation. They are moving toward the planet." I said, "How fast?" He said, "Slow enough to be deliberate, not a tactical approach, a demonstration." I said, "Understood. Sound general readiness throughout the ship." Then I opened a channel to all 6 of the co-petitioning species vessels which had been positioned near us in a loose formation since the previous day. I said, "This is Commander Solis. The Verk fleet is moving. We are holding position. Our purpose here is to protect the tribunal. That is all we are doing. We are not engaging unless engaged. We are standing between them and the chamber. That is our job today." Across the channel, one by one, the other commanders acknowledged. The Gret captain said, "We are with you." The Talani support vessel, they were not a military ship, they had no weapons, but they had come anyway, said, "We are with you." Then something happened that I will spend the rest of my life trying to adequately describe. The long-range sensors lit up. Not from the Verk direction, from the outer system, from multiple points simultaneously, jump signatures blooming one after another on the display like lights coming on in a dark building. Colin was already at the secondary console, reading the identifications as they came through, and his voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. He said, "Yara, the Alani fleet, the Mevin, the Juro Cooperative, the Soreth Alliance." He paused, the Dihar. I said, "How many total?" He said, "Still counting, over 200 vessels, maybe more." Ben said very quietly, "They came. Not because we had asked them to, which we had not. Not because we had organized it, which we had not, because we would not have known who to call or how to reach them. They came because the message had traveled in those quiet back-channel networks, through the gaps in the Council's communication architecture, through 2 years of conversations that had happened between species who had never been permitted to speak directly to each other before. They came because Senna had stood up in the Council chamber 18 months earlier and told the truth, and the truth had moved through the galaxy in ways that no single person could track or direct. The Verk fleet stopped. 230 ships by the final count, arranged in a loose arc around Vel Prime, not aggressive, not pointed at anyone, simply present, simply visible, a statement delivered without a single word on any channel. The Verk's consul Draveth sent one communication. It went to George Alderton's terminal. It said, "This is not over." George sent back 3 words. He said, "We know, good." Inside the chamber, the tribunal deliberated for 6 hours. I spent most of that time on the bridge, which is where I think best, walking slowly between the stations and talking to my crew in the particular way you talk to people when you are all waiting for something enormous, and there is nothing to do but wait. Priya sat at the engineering console even though there was no engineering work to be done. She had a tablet in her hands and was reading something. I think she was rereading her own notes from the drive checks, just to have something to look at. Owen Price had come aboard from the Lewis to be present for the tribunal results, and he stood near the back of the bridge and said almost nothing, which was very unlike him, and which told me he understood the weight of it. Kate Drummond sat at the weapons console with her hands very still in her lap, which she only did when she was keeping herself deliberately calm. Colin stood near me. He did not talk much, but he was there, and that was enough. The result came through on the official council broadcast channel at 3:47 in the afternoon, Vel Prime local time. The tribunal panel, 17 delegates from non-dominant species, which itself was a thing that had never happened before in 600 years, had reached a unanimous finding. The Galactic Council's legal structure, as constituted, was in fundamental conflict with the Founding Charter's provisions on equal representation and shared sovereignty. The Kell provision was valid and applicable. The filing was upheld in full. A constitutional Congress was mandated within one standard year to revise the foundational framework of council membership and law. Unanimous. Colin read the summary over my shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly, the kind of long breath that holds a lot of things in it, and said, "There it is." Priya set down her tablet and put her face in her hands for a moment. Not in distress. I recognized it as the thing she did when she was feeling something strongly and needed a second to process it. Ben Calloway, who had been on watch since 4 in the morning and had not said anything for 2 hours, said, "Yes, right, good." I laughed. I could not help it. There was something perfect about that. Yes, right, good. The Verk and 2 other dominant species formally walked out of the council session within the hour. They filed their own legal objections before leaving, which was in some ways a sign that they still believed in the process even while opposing its outcome, and in other ways simply a demonstration that people with power are reluctant to leave the room they have always controlled. I was not surprised. I had not expected this to end their resistance. I had expected it to begin something else, a harder, longer, messier process of building something new from the inside of something old. That is what constitutional reform actually looks like. Not a moment of victory, but a beginning of work. George Alderton held a brief statement outside the tribunal building. He was surrounded by representatives from 14 species, including Senna, who stood beside him with the composed and settled expression of someone who has accomplished the thing they set out to accomplish. George thanked everyone who had contributed. He spoke about the importance of the process. He said, and I noted this carefully, "Today is not the end of anything. It is the first honest day of something that should have begun 600 years ago." I watched the broadcast from the bridge. When it ended, I went back to my observation window. Vel Prime below. The planet unchanged, as planets are, indifferent to the events of the small beings who conduct their large arguments above it. The fleet formations were beginning to disperse. The 230 ships that had come from across the galaxy were returning to wherever they had come from, their statement made, their presence recorded, their choice documented. The Verk fleet had already gone. The Defiant hung in orbit, steady and quiet, her drive running clean, her crew beginning to relax in the incremental way that people relax after sustained tension, slowly, cautiously, as if not quite trusting that it is real yet. I sat in my chair on the bridge for a long time. Eventually, I pulled out my log and began to write. I wrote, "They said we broke every law. Maybe we did. But some laws are not written to protect people. They are written to protect the people who write them, and the difference matters enormously, even if it is not always visible from the inside. We came to this galaxy as newcomers, as the youngest and least experienced and most violating species in the Council's history, and we found something that 600 years of members had missed. Not because we were smarter, not because we were braver, though I believe our people were both when it mattered. We found it because we were new enough that we had not yet learned to stop looking, because we arrived without the long memory of what had been tried and failed. Because we read their own founding document and believed it meant what it said, and then we were furious when it did not, and we refused to stop being furious in the quiet, productive way that changes things. We did not conquer anyone. We did not threaten anyone who did not first threaten us. We did not win anything for ourselves alone. The thing we won, if we won it, belongs to the Talani and the Gret and the Alani and the Dihar and every species that sent a ship to orbit above Vel Prime when they did not have to, when nobody had promised them it would work, when the only thing that moved them was the idea that it should work. That is what we protected in Kepler, above those three worlds that never knew, not just lives. The idea that lives are worth protecting. The idea that people who cannot defend themselves still count. If that sounds simple, that is because it is simple, and simple things are often the ones that take the longest to fight for, because they are the easiest to say and the hardest to mean. We meant it. That is all. We meant it, and we did not stop meaning it, and it turned out that was enough, though only barely, and only this time, and there is more work ahead than behind. I know that. I am glad of it. I would not have it any other way. I closed the notebook. Outside, Vel Prime turned slowly in the light of its sun. The drive hummed. We were still here.